We are very blessed to have Brother Ong Kok to exhort us on our fifth annual Mission Sunday. Brother Corbin and his wife Esther have devoted their life to the ministry of the gospel and is one of the longest serving ministers among the churches of Christ in Singapore and Malaysia. They have migrated to Australia because of their children and grandchild, and at this time, Brother Corbin is putting together material for a book on the history of the churches of Christ in Singapore and Malaysia. We are fortunate to be the first ones to benefit from his intensive research on the history of the churches of Christ in Singapore. I hope we will be encouraged by the tremendous amount of evangelism, missions of the church as he shares with us the history of the churches of Christ in Singapore. Brother Corbin is the most qualified minister among the churches of Christ in Singapore and Malaysia because he have not obtained just 1 or 2 degrees, but 3. He came to Singapore and US, graduated, went to Malaysia, served the church in KL, got another degree, and then served the church in Seraman, nurturing the members and their children so that the church in Seraman now owns 2 buildings in different parts of Seraman. And they received a 3rd degree in America, ACU. This evening, so happy to have Brother Corbin to exhort us.
Thank you, Henry, for the kind introduction. I'm so glad to be here to just share with you the Word of God. I actually invited myself for this particular job. I kind of let Henry know that I'm coming, and could I preach for that Sunday, okay? My main purpose is to come and visit the household of faith here to see how the congregation here is doing. Henry has been sending me updates on the church here, and I was very keen on wanting to come and visit with you. I'm given 20 minutes, and 20 minutes is not sufficient to give you the whole history of the church in Singapore, and I'm also to kind of give an emphasis on missions, since this is your missions Sunday. So I'll just skim through the brief history of the churches in Singapore. Just a kind of introduction to this history thing. Back in the 1970s, around 74, 75, when I finished my Form 5, I was walking with, is it okay? Yeah, all right, sorry, forgot now. I was walking with Chong Fat on the beaches in Tanjung Munga. You know, those days, the beaches were very, very wonderful in Tanjung Munga, Penang. Okay? And he would be telling stories about Ken Sinclair, about Tan Keng Kun, about Henry Kong, about Gordon Hogan, and all that. And at that time, I've never left Penang at all. And so these names were very, very strange to me. But I was curious. I was wondering who were these people, what do they look like, and so on and so forth. And then in 1997 to 98, when I was at ACU, I came upon a small file of reports from Ira Y. Rice. And that was the first time I read a little bit about the history of the work he had done in Singapore. And then in 2014, when I was on a sabbatical leave to attend a semester at the Harding School of Theology, I came upon a pile of files of newsletters and reports from the missionaries that were here in Singapore and Indonesia and Malaysia. And that prompted me to kind of say, hey, why not just write a history, do a history of the churches? And I kind of quickly, at first when I was doing this, I was hand copying all the relevant points and all that. And after 2 or 3 days of hand copying all this, I said, this is impossible, okay? And so I spoke to the librarian, and he was kind enough to point me to a machine and say that you could copy the files there and send them on the Gmail to your computer. And that's how I got all the files, the pertinent files. In any case, that's how I got into this project. But I didn't get to sit to write this history until last year, okay? I'm not a man of good at multitasking, so when I was ministering at Seremban, it was quite difficult to kind of sit down and write the history. All right? So the first missionary that came to Singapore, or this part of the world, was Ira Y. Rice Jr. and his wife, Vada. They landed at the old Kallang Airport at 12:45 a.m. on March 9, 1955. And the reason why Ira Y. Rice chose Singapore was because he came into contact with Cecil Chen. Cecil Chen was a nephew of Henry Tan Siak Sang, okay? And Rice kind of told him he said that he wanted to go to a place where English was a common language, and he could preach the language, the gospel in English, but the people would be multilingual. They would be speaking in many, many other languages, okay? And so he said, the reason is I'll preach to them in English. They would then take the gospel to other parts of the world in their own language. And then Cecil Chen says that, I know that place, Singapore, my hometown city. And that's how Rice came to Singapore. When Rice landed in Singapore, he stayed with a person by the name of George Zhong. George Zhong was a Harding a student, a graduate of Harding College, and he was baptized by George Benson, who was in charge of mission. And George Benson was a missionary to China, okay? He was a missionary to China. So the Rice family stayed with George Zhong, and then on the morning when they woke up for the breakfast, George Zhong kind of told Ira Y. Rice, he says, I no longer believe in God or the Bible or salvation, the necessity for salvation. Okay, so that hit Ira Y. Rice like a rock. If any of you had met or had known Ira Y. Rice, then you would have known his character and his person and how hard that would have hit him. Okay, so Ira Y. Rice was counting on George Zhong to be his partner in the gospel, in the mission work in Singapore. And when George Zhong told him, I no longer believe in God or the church or the Bible or in salvation, that was very, very tough on him. And so he immediately packed up his bag and went to stay with Cecil Chen and his family. Cecil Chen was, he studied at the University of California in Berkeley, and he had actually quite an interesting history himself. He actually was part of the U.S. Air Force in the towards the end of the World War II. Okay, and he kind of he didn't actually fly. Okay, a fighter, because when he went in, the war had ended. Okay. In any case, Rice went to stay with Cecil Chen, and then the first worship service was in mid-March 1955 in the home of the Chens, and this is the first worship service, all right, the picture of the first worship service and the attendees, okay. And then subsequently, Rice purchased the property at Moulmein Road in 1955, and then they had a dedication service in 1958 and then 1959. That's not too important. Okay. Let's move on. So the first converts, the first local converts, Lai Hongming was the first convert of Rice, okay, and it was quite an interesting story. Rice met a person by the name of John Wong, and John Wong was preaching to a group of people, and Rice kind of described that group of people for all the things, all the teachings and all the things that they practiced were very similar to what the Church of Christ had been teaching, except for one thing, the piano, okay, the use of musical instrument. And so Rice kind of studied with John Wong, and subsequently John Wong agreed to give up the piano. And but the important thing here is that John Wong introduced Rice to Lai Hongming. Now Lai Hongming was in Muar, not in Singapore, okay? Lai Hongming's hometown was in Muar, and Lai Hongming was a preacher to a church or a group that is known as a Jesus Christ Church. And this group had come out of the Methodist Church to worship on their own, and they call themselves the Jesus Christ Church. Lai Hongming introduced Rice to Chiu Seng Tek, the father of David Chiu. I need to give this history, this part of Malaysia, because this was, when Rice came in, he was very heavily involved in the southern part of Johor in Muar and Kluang. Okay, so this is part and parcel of the history. Now, Chiu Seng Tek was a Presbyterian, and the congregation that he led were Presbyterians. And one thing Chiu Seng Tek did not like about the Presbyterian setup was that he had actually to report to the higher ups in the Presbyterian church. That means he had to report to somebody else about his work in Kluang. And he did not like that. And so when Rice studied with him, Rice told him that in Churches of Christ, every church is autonomous, and no one need to report to anyone. Okay. In any case, Lai Hongming acted as a translator for Rice during his conversations with Chiu Seng Tek and the Kluang church. Okay. And when Rice was preaching in this Kluang church, he said that when I came to baptism, I emphasized on this baptism, this necessity of baptism, but nobody responded to baptism. And then on a night that returned, Henry Tan was with Rice, and on a return trip, Henry Tan said that you need to speak to Lai Hongming about this thing called baptism. And then on the next morning, Lai Hongming came all the way from Muar on his motorcycle to be baptized by Rice. Lai Hongming, as far as the story goes, he said that he had studied all night on this word baptism. He had kind of taken up his concordance and kind of studied on this word baptism. And he said that he had mistranslated the word baptism as sui. In Hokkien, sui or Teochew sui, it means to wash. Okay, it means to wash. Instead of mai zhang, mai zhong. Mai means to bury. Okay? And so when Lai Hongming was translating the word baptism, he was translating it as sui, to wash. And the Presbyterians were saying, oh, we have been washed in water. And that's why they did not respond to baptism, to Rice's invitation for baptism. In any case, that's the history, and that's how Lai Hongming became Rice's first convert, and he was baptized on 30th June 1955. Moa became the first congregation, or rather Kluang, the Moa and Kluang became the first two congregations to become the Churches of Christ in Malaysia. And then we have Charlie Ng, Henry Tan, Tan Keng Kun, and Samuel Miao. Okay, I won't go into the details of those. And then we have the next missionary to come into Singapore were the Harbins, Leroy Harbin and Fanny Harbin. They came because of this Million for a Billion campaign in the United States that took place for almost a year between 1955, November 50. Let me just try to get the dates again. August 59 to November 1960. And so it was during this campaign that Rice came into contact with Gordon Hogan and Leroy Harbin. Okay, and so Harbin and Hogan decided to come over to Asia. Hogan wanted to go to India, and Harbin wanted to come to Singapore. Okay, so in any case, all the three families took a trip to Europe, cutting through Middle East, and then intending to come down to India and Singapore. Okay, just to cut the story short, Harbin arrived in Singapore sometime in February 1961, but he left very abruptly on 15 April 1962. On the Sunday that he preached to the Mormon congregation, he said to the congregation, "I'm going back to America tomorrow." Just announced like that. All right. The reason I will not reveal here, but it will be in the records. Okay. There was some kind of misunderstanding between him and Rice, so to speak. Okay. Then Harbin came back in 1964. Okay. Between 1961 and 1962 and 1964, I think Harbin was in Australia. Okay, doing mission work in Australia. But in 1964, he came back, and he helped to set up the Queenstown Church of Christ. With some 15 or 20 members from Mormon Road, he planted the church there. This is the description that Harbin gave of the first meeting of the church in Queenstown. He says, "We met in the living room of Polly Lee's rented flat with two Christians, all right, two Christian boys, Jiu Jiong Ji and Jiong Jin Kiet for worship. And we three, with one outsider, were the only ones for that first service." Okay. And then, of course, you have Henry Kong and Nat Kong that were involved in Queenstown. Harbin wrote about how he had three young, splendid men that helped him in the work at Queenstown. And of these three young men was Henry Kong, and Henry Kong was one of the first graduates of the Malaysia Christian College set up by Painstakers at Mormon Road. Harbin reported of Henry Kong. He says, "Brother Henry Kong, one of our 20-year-old preacher trainees, who after graduation from Malaysia Christian College studied daily with me for more than a year of our perpetual gospel meetings, is working with the congregation and baptized two more during the first 4 weeks after our departure of America." Now, on this perpetual gospel meeting, it's quite interesting to let you know, Harbin held a perpetual gospel, and Henry Kong can tell you that also, all right? It ran for more than 400 days straight on without a break. Sunday to Sunday, every evening. So it was in the evening, okay, without a break. I think it was 448 days, if I remember correctly, okay? Don Green tried to repeat it in Ipoh, but Don Green's perpetual gospel meeting was 195 days. Okay. So I don't know how they lasted that long. Okay, today if you try to conduct a gospel meeting for 3 or 4 or 5 nights, the attendance will just dwindle by the third or the fourth night. Okay. In any case, that was what it was in those days. So in taking over the ministry reins from Harbin, Henry Kong became the first graduate of Malaysia Christian College, the precursor of Forsyth College, to go into full-time preaching in Singapore. And Henry himself put this date as the 1st of May, 1966, as the day I started working full-time in the ministry. Okay? But even before Harbin had come, there were a group of young people from Moulmein Road that had gone to Queenstown to start personal and evangelism work there, and Henry was one of them. Okay. Others that came along were Pence and Janice Dacres, and Pence Dacres was the one that was instrumental in setting up Malaysia Christian College. And the story of how Pence Dacres came to Singapore is quite interesting, but I don't have time to relate that to you. Others were Gordon Hogan, and then later Ken Sinclair. Ken Sinclair is more involved in Seremban in Malaysia, but he was in Singapore in the 1980s when he set up the church at Bukit Panjang. But the man chiefly responsible for the establishment of the Moulmein Church of Christ was Gordon Hogan. When Gordon Hogan came, the Moulmein Church of Christ was decimated. Okay, it was reduced to some. Rice said there were about 12 or 13 left, but Gordon Hogan kind of said the number was just about 4. All right. Now this was because there was a conflict between Rice and Samuel Miao, and Samuel Miao was disfellowshipped, and Samuel Miao kind of went to another place to worship on his own, and most of the people went along with Samuel Miao. Most of the Malaysia Christian College students, there were some of 8 or 9 or 10 of them, okay, went along with Samuel Miao, except for Henry Kong. I think Henry Kong was the only one that did not go along with that. Those graduates of MCC, okay. We need to give credit to others like Dave and Debbie Hogan. Tony and Karen Gross came for a while, Ron Otsmans and David Peggy. And what I'm interested to kind of tell you is that in those days there were some ladies that came over to work as church secretaries, and their chief responsibility was to grade the Bible correspondence course. And Thelma Eubank was a principal figure among those ladies. Jalita Glaze, she was briefly here for a while, and quite interestingly, when I sat in the Revelation class in ACU, I met Jalita Glaze in the class, and she told me that she was in Singapore. Okay. All right, let me just quickly rush on. Okay, these are the churches that were set up. The first local church set up by local people were Geylang and Upper Serangoon, okay, Lima Pin. And then Jurong was the outreach of Moulmein Road and all the other churches. So these are some of the churches that I could list here. And then the local preachers on here. Okay. In terms of evangelism and making converts, how did these missionaries make their converts? The usual method in those days were Bible correspondence course. Rice had his basic Bible correspondence course, and I was one of them that took the basic Bible correspondence course and that was baptized because of that course. Okay, I had never attended Churches of Christ. I had never attended a church service in my lifetime before I was baptized, and so it was all due to this basic Bible correspondence course. Gospel meetings and the campaigns, personal work and friendship evangelism. I must tell you about this Bible correspondence course. It was pretty popular in those days, but the students who took these courses were kind of spread out all over Malaysia and Singapore, you know. And when one student says that I want to be baptized, he might be somewhere far off in Kuala Kelawang. Kuala Kelawang is somewhere in Jelubu, and I really admire these preachers. They'll take their car, drive it is actually in the mountainous, hilly region, and they can go through those snaky hill regions, driving some 60 miles just to baptize one or two persons. Okay. All right. So this brings us to the first converts. The first converts were mostly students. All right. And Rice kind of got himself into Dale Carnegie because he was finding that the converts were he called them rock bottom socially, educationally, financially, and in every way. He says they were wonderful people, no doubt, before God. For God has chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith. Yet if a way to reach those a little higher had not been opened unto us, I'm quite sure the cost in Singapore should have been decades, not just years, getting on its own. Okay, and this is actually one of the reasons why Churches of Christ never kind of quite take off, because most of the converts in those early days were young students who were not really stable in their faith, or when they grew up, they had other places to go. Okay, and that's something else. So I want to kind of focus in on that education, and these are some of the early graduates of MCC. I need to go into this on doing missions, all right, since this is your missions Sunday. Gordon Hogan described the task of evangelism as the awesome task of evangelism, okay? And evangelism is a necessary work of the church. Without evangelism, without winning souls for Christ, then the church cannot continue to grow and function. I'd like to read a passage from Paul in Romans 10. Paul says that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one on whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And so on this work of missions, doing missions in a foreign land, or even here in what we call your own backyard, your own hinterland, first of all, we must have this awareness that there is a world out there without Christ. After the Second World War, a lot of Americans were exposed to the world outside America. And I just want to relate one particular story from Frank Pierce. I asked him, why did you become a preacher, and what were you doing before? And then he says that he had served America in the Korean War. He was a pole climber. That means he was in the communications corps, and his job was to climb up the electric poles to make sure that the communication lines are connected. Okay, and he says that after the Second World War, he was awakened to this, that there were people outside of America that did not have the gospel, and that's how he decided to be one. And so there must be a willingness to preach the gospel, to be one of those fit to go out into the world and make disciples of all nations. And then there must be a vision to grow the local congregation, a vision to establish and grow churches elsewhere. And, when Gordon Hogan first began his ministry work in Moulmein Road, and then, of course, his work at the Forces College, he says, I look forward to training an army of missionaries. He had this vision of training an army of missionaries. He had a vision that by 1976, Moulmein Road would grow to 1,600 members. And then he would have missionaries going out into every region, into every town and every region across Malaysia and Singapore and beyond. Well, Hogan did not quite actually have that army of missionaries, but he did train quite a number of them, about 20, 30 of them that became preachers in Singapore and Malaysia and elsewhere. He did not quite achieve 1,600 at Moulmein Road, but by 1975, he had something like more than 200 members in Moulmein Road. That's from 4 when he first came in 1968. Okay. People and finance. To do mission work, you need people. You need people who are willing to go out, but you need the money to support them. That's why in the 1950s, America had that $1 million for the billion campaign. And today, you are having this Missions Sunday to encourage you to give for mission work. Sacrifice and courage. For this part on sacrifice and courage, I want to tell the story of a couple by the name of Richard and Wanima Matlock. They were missionaries in Seremban. Both of them were teachers. They came into contact with Judd Whitefield, who was a missionary to Seremban and KL. They met Judd Whitefield twice, and Judd Whitefield each time encouraged them to come to Malaysia to be missionaries. So on November 1964, they decided to go where the Lord should lead them and be full-time workers for the Lord. And then Wanima wrote this: I feel my greatest decision was that of leaving my mother, not knowing if we will ever see each other again in this life. I keep thinking of our duty to her, but I then remember Matthew 10:37. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. I found this to be very poignant because Wanima Matlock lost her life in Seremban. One day she was plugging in a table lamp and she was electrocuted. So what she wrote there, she did not know whether she would be seeing her mother again or not. Kind of had a tragic prophetic ring to it. But there was a kind of sacrifice that people like Richard and Wanima Matlock were willing to give in order to serve Christ, in order to be the feet that will go out and preach the gospel of Christ. And then faith and persistence. We need to have faith and we need to have persistence, okay, to preach the gospel. Just coming back to this, this point of sacrifice and courage, I want to tell a story about Harbin on his living condition in a shed room across the back downstairs. Some of you may be old enough to remember your first meeting place at Tanglin Hot, okay? And when Harbin was here, he stayed at the back room behind the hall. I think that's how I imagine it to be, all right? He described his living condition as this. Our floor was bare, rough concrete. Our walls were naked concrete blocks, no windows, space apart for ventilation. Our roof of corrugated metal, no ceiling, held heat from the equatorial sun past midnight in dry weather, and had structural leaks to be avoided with our canvas cots in wet weather. Our closets for clothes, linen, and dishes were of rough shipping boxes set on ends and supported by bricks placed under the corners. When I first read this, I was overwhelmed with tears, just kind of see how. And Harbin was not a young man at that time. He was quite elderly, and for him to kind of be living in that kind of condition, it was really, really difficult for him and the wife. So that is sacrifice and courage, okay? And on faith and persistence, I must again cite Harbin's example. Remember, he returned 1962, he left Singapore, and then he came back in 1964, all right? He says, I returned on pure faith, without sponsor, without visible means of support, and without visa. So on that second time he came over to Singapore, he had no support, no sponsor, no visa. But God made, I can't even recognize my own handwriting now. But God made a way, all right? But God made a way. I soon had all three: sponsor, support, and visa. And this is how many of the missionaries work on. You know, their engines of a missionary work were not the Porsches or the Ferraris. Okay, they are running on old creaky pistons. They had faith, they had courage, and they just simply were willing to do the work of the Lord. God bless you as you give to the work of the Lord here in the household of faith, and may you have people to rise up and to go out into the world and make disciples of all nations, teaching them and to obey all the commands I've